What we want to talk about, I titled The Social History of the Early Nephites, and the problem is I think I'm probably the only person that understands what I mean by that. What we want to do is we want to take a look at the world of the early Book of Mormon and try to put it into a context so that we can see these people as real people and responding to real times, real places, and real issues. That's what's behind it. I took some time thinking while I was out there of whether or not I was going to try to be a really interesting speaker and just speak off the cuff, or whether I was going to give you information. Information wins. If I tried to give you this information without reading what's here, it would take longer than they're going to give me. Last time I read through this, I think I was going to run close to my 50 minutes, and we don't want to go quite that far because I'd love to field some questions. So I'm going to read through this thing, and stick with me. What I will hope happens is that you will learn some things about the Book of Mormon that you have not thought of before. To start off with, if we're piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, the most helpful tool that we have is the picture on the box that gives us the big picture of what it is we're trying to put together in the first place. By seeing that larger picture, we get an idea of what the individual pieces might be, and that allows us to put them together. The Book of Mormon is very much that kind of a jigsaw puzzle. The problem is, we don't have a box that tells us what the picture's like. So we have all the pieces and they're sitting out there, but we're missing the big picture. And finding that overall picture becomes part of another piece of the puzzle that we're working on. The task for an historical understanding of the Book of Mormon is complicated in that there are a minimum of 2 pictures of the Book of Mormon that will help us understand the historical framework. Both the Old World and the New World provide gross locations of historical context. Of the 2, the most accessible is the Old World context because we know the essentials of time, location, and the contemporary culture. That means that we got a pretty good shot at figuring out what the picture might be so that when we place the Book of Mormon events that happen in the Old World against that picture, we've got a shot of understanding what it's like. In this discussion, we're going to examine the New World in an attempt to find a similar time, context, and contemporary culture with which to better see the text of the Book of Mormon. Now, before suggesting an answer, we need to understand when we have found a plausible big picture. For instance, how do we know that we have found something that approaches probability rather than sheer coincidence? If I would suggest that such 19th century sounding elements such as tents, scalping, democracy, and infant baptism are coincidences, and I do, how can I judge that statement objectively? The Book of Mormon differs from a jigsaw puzzle in that it is not a complete representation of the overall cultural picture in which it participates. Because the text does not clearly spell out the relevant location and contemporary culture, we're free to float among possible pictures, picking points of correspondence between a picture we understand and the text before us. Let's see, I gotta get to the point where I read better. That method leads to a collection of coincident points, but not to a comprehensive or a plausible picture of the contemporary culture of the text. To find the correct picture, instead of only a possible picture, we must have a particular type of correspondence. The best picture will not only have single points of correspondence, but complex ones. A simple correspondence would be tents. It's easy to say that the American Plains Indians had tents, and therefore that gives us a context for the tent in the Book of Mormon. It is just as easy to say that there were temporary structures in Mesoamerica, and that gives us a context for the Book of Mormon. Since it's a single point, the real world can freely spin around that point, and we can look at all kinds of pictures, times, and contexts, because that's a single piece of information. What we need is not those single pieces of information, but complex interrelated connections so that we have multiple points at which we make that contact. And we can't spin back and forth between an argument that says there were tents in the Plains Indians, there were tents in Mesoamerica. Neither one of those proves anything because both statements are true. The question is, for the Book of Mormon, which one provides the context? If we have a single complex correlation between the text and a particular point in culture, that's suggestive of something, but it isn't conclusive. Because again, if we're really lucky, you could have a coincidence that just so happened to match 2 or 3 coincident points. What we really need, if we're going to get a good determination of what the picture of the Book of Mormon is a multiple set of complex interrelating points. The more things that start stacking up against each other, the more things that require the same interpretive picture, the more pieces of the puzzle that fit together in only one way, the more chance we have of understanding that what we've found is a picture that actually has a chance of representing the cultural context of the Book of Mormon. Now, of the 3 critical components of an interpretive picture, the only one that I'm really going to deal with in this discussion is the cultural context. The time we don't have to worry about. Time is told to us in the Book of Mormon, and whether we deal with 1 or 2 years here or there as part of the correlation is really irrelevant because we can't date things historically in archaeology that tightly anyway. So we have to deal with the rough time, and we know the time for the Book of Mormon, and we know when it's going to show up in the New World. As for a location, I'm not a geographer. The best geographical correlation of which I'm aware is John Sorensen's correlation. They call it the limited Tehuantepec theory. And for the purposes of what we're going to talk about, assume that I accept that. What we're going to do is say if the Book of Mormon is to have taken place at the time that it says it took place, and in the location that it appears plausible to have taken place according to this correlation, what do we learn? What can we tell about the Book of Mormon given that background and that cultural context? We necessarily begin with the origin of Lehi's people in the New World. It is indisputable that Lehi and his company landed on a coast. Think about that. Had to happen. John Sorensen was the first one to point that out to me, and I said, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. Had to happen. And the coast of Guatemala is the plausible location according to Sorensen's reconstruction. If a ship carrying Lehi's party were to have arrived on the coast of Guatemala approximately 590 years before Christ, what would they have found? Would they have been alone, or would there have been anyone there to meet them? The archaeological survey of middle formative sites for coast of Guatemala deals with sites dated some 200 years earlier than Lehi's landing, so we have to make a few assumptions. First of all, 200 years prior to Lehi's arrival, there were 7 settlements ranging from 1 household to 12 households. So there were people there, small groups. After this time, the coastal area saw a peak of population density not seen until the late Classic period over 1,000 years later. It's important to understand that the settlement areas were not necessarily larger, but simply more numerous. So we still have small units, hamlets perhaps at the most, maybe a village or 2, but we have a few more of them. What this tells us is that Lehi's company would have found it nearly impossible to have remained isolated for long if they were ever isolated at all. Even with a relatively sparse settlement along the coast, the typical radius for finding food would have led to some overlap of territories among the various populations. Those settlements that had been in place for years would certainly have known of other settlements along the coast. Smoke from cooking fires would easily be seen on scouting trips, if not visible without that. And it is quite probable that the arrival of a ship with sails would have been noticed while it was still on the horizon. And although we don't know for sure and certainly couldn't tell you, it is not implausible that Lehi's ship was met when it landed. They would have seen the ship coming. The next thing we learn, Lehi's company entered an area that was dominated by small hamlets and perhaps a few villages. Such conditions would favor the acceptance of their party into those small communities. If they were seen as bringing important skills, a hamlet or 2 might be willing to join with them, and even willing to cede leadership to the new arrivals. Larger cities, however, might see them as threats and be less likely to desire to merge with them, and certainly would not be willing to give up their sovereignty in favor of the newcomers, as we see happening with Lehi's party, because we know that they were the leaders. So if they came in, the fact that they came into a coast with smaller hamlets not only favors the fact that they would have merged with them, but provides the precise conditions where we would have had them not only merge but end up as leaders. It would not have happened with larger communities. Fortunately, they weren't there. Lehi's company had every reason to accept aid from and a merger with local populations. Lehi's group planted seeds from the old world, but a rapid acquisition of information about the survival skills particular to the new world would have been extremely important. They would have needed to know about the local food sources that were successful, local sources of materials for clothing, and the locations and types of clay for pottery, and any number of location-specific cultural information. The first indication that we have that this merger took place, and took place this early, we get from 2nd Nephi. When Nephi is fleeing his brothers, and he and his party are leaving this apparent coastal area and apparently moving up into the highlands of Guatemala, he leaves, and in 2nd Nephi verses 5 through 6, we get these verses. And it came to pass that the Lord did warn me that I, Nephi, should depart from them and flee into the wilderness, and all those who would go with me. So here's the critical phrase. He says, I'm going to take everybody who's going to go with me. And so he begins to name the people who are going to go with him. In verse 6, wherefore it came to pass that I, Nephi, did take my family, and also Zoram and his family, and Sam, mine elder brother, and his family, and Jacob and Joseph, my younger brethren, and also my sisters, and all those who would go with me. Now, Nephi names all those who would go with me. When we account for the named individuals, there's a little room left. When he finished naming everybody that we can possibly think of, he still says, all those who would go with me. The only people who are unaccounted for are the sons of Ishmael. And you would think that by the time he's given us that litany of the people who are going with him, that if it was only one or two more, he might have named them, like he named everybody else. But he doesn't. He names everybody we could possibly think of that would go with him. And then he says, and all those who would go with me. Who were they? The most logical assumption is that they were the people that were this hamlet that had gone with them at this point in time. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is setting up the hypothesis, first of all, that there were other people there. Secondly, that there was a joining of those people. And say to ourselves, what does that tell us about what we see in the rest of the Book of Mormon? The very first thing that happens is that we see that with the addition of others into Nephi's party, we have a larger core of people than we could possibly have with the separation of only those who had arrived with Lehi. There are three events that occur in the early city of Nephi that would appear to confirm the presence of more people than those who had come from the old world. About 30 years after the departure from Jerusalem, Nephi describes some of the events of the establishment of the city of Nephi. First, he describes not only having built dwellings, but also a temple. Public building projects require excess labor. Even on a modest scale, a public building takes time and resources away from daily life. The very existence of a public building suggests a larger population than the pure old world immigrants and their natural increase would have been able to provide. The second event that indicates the presence of a larger population is the declaration of Nephi as a king. Naming a man king if there are only 12 men is an insult. How can you be king if there's only 12 men? Okay? Third, we have the designation of Jacob and Joseph as priests and teachers over the land of my people. Were we to assume only people who had arrived from the old world at this point in time, 30 years after they had departed, we would have a king and 2 professional priests administering to 12 families. That's too much. The Nephite cultural organization at this early point in the Book of Mormon is way too top-heavy to support the theory that the only people that were there came from the old world. The only thing that makes these verses make sense is the presence of other people at this particular point in time and at this early date in Nephite history. Now, once again, we take that piece of information, we say, okay, now we have, at this point in time, probable presence of non-old world peoples in the city of Nephi. Does that tell us anything about the rest of what we hear in the city of Nephi? The plausible presence of these others among the Nephites at this early point provides a context for a strange choice that Nephi makes when recording on his personal plates. In 2 Nephi 6, Nephi records a sermon that Jacob gave. And I'm not going to read this one. This one's easier to explain. Nephi goes to his brother and he says, I got a text in Isaiah I want you to preach on. Here's a text. And he gives him the text, and the text is all about the distant future salvation of Israel by the Gentiles. Now I want you to think about how weird this is. You have a people who's just been struggling to get themselves established in a new world. They've been around for 30 years, but even after 30 years, it's got to be still a bit of a struggle to make sure that life happens. And so the king decides that we ought to have a lesson. And he dictates that what we really need to know right now is about the Israelites in the old world, about Gentiles that we don't even know anything about, but they're in the old world, and they're going to save these Israelites in the old world thousands of years in the future. Why? If we understand, however, that at this point in time there were non-lineal Nephites, New World Nephites, not Old World Nephites, then all of a sudden the context of this speech becomes not one of looking at some esoteric theological future, but it is Nephi's position of likening the scriptures to themselves and saying, maybe we've had some conflicts with these new people that we're trying to come in, and it might be really important for you to understand that they may be your salvation someday, so get along with them. And all of a sudden, this abstract thing that doesn't make any sense has a very powerful and immediate social and political context. So far, we've examined points of correspondence that require only contact with another people. Now we turn to some events that require the particular content of Mesoamerica at the very time period of the Book of Mormon. The first example is another of Jacob's sermon. In this case, we have Jacob's first recorded sermon in his own book, encompassing Jacob chapters 2 and 3. This sermon is much more problematic than Jacob's discourse on the future salvation by the Gentiles. The problem is first his choice of topics. He has two topics. He's really unhappy about their use of riches, and he's really unhappy about polygyny. They're taking more than one wives. The first problem we have is a simple structural one. Why in the world did he combine those two things together? You know, even if they were the two biggest things that he had to talk to him about, why didn't he break them into two sermons? Why did he link them together? Now, when we examine the two pieces, we come up with even more problems. This is a sermon that doesn't make any sense. Okay? Starting with Jacob's sermon on riches, the first problem with the sermon is that he presents what should have been an impossible situation. He suggests that they have become wealthy because of the gold and silver that they found, elements that he calls abundant. That should be impossible. First of all, in Mesoamerica, gold and silver have never had, at least up until the time of the conquest, never had an intrinsic value. They called them the excrement of the gods. They were just things that were around. They're nice because you can make things out of them, but they never used them as a medium of exchange. They used cacao beans instead of gold. That was much more valuable to them. So first of all, we're in an area of the world that should not have cared about gold. Secondly, it is absolutely impossible to get rich on something that you can pick up off the ground. And anybody can do it. If these are elements that are abundant, value doesn't come from something that's abundant. If every one of us could walk outside and pick up huge armloads of gold, I can guarantee you that there wouldn't be much value in trading it with each other. Finally, we have the manifestation of this wealth in costly apparel. This is another situation that should not exist. In an isolated community with no department stores, clothing is made by the community. The same materials are available to all. The same dyes are available to all. Even stylistic changes tend to be widely copied. It's common for villages to have an almost uniform dress rather than the segregation created by dress. Under the assumptions that are commonly brought to the Book of Mormon text, that of a group of people alone in the land, it should be virtually impossible to have costly apparel. There is a condition, however, that explains all of Jacob's economic problems. That condition is trade. And again, you'll notice that we are presuming that there are people in the land, just like there were people when the Lehites landed on the coast. There are archaeological populations in highland Guatemala. These people probably engaged in trade with them. If we make that presumption, a very logical presumption of trade, human beings trade, it's one of the human universals. There have been anthropologists who've studied the things that make us alike. Trade is one of them. Gossip's another, by the way. If we take a look at trade, lots of things happen. If we assume that the gold and silver are being worked using metalworking skills that Nephi could have taught them, then these worked goods could even have an exchange value with other cities, and the resulting importation of goods creates a situation where those who engaged in the trade accumulate more of their unique prestige goods than those who did not trade outside of their own city. Thus, trade provides exactly the conditions that Jacob is combating, that of social differentiation. The process of trade would have brought not only esoteric goods, but also a mechanism for the very social differentiation that Jacob excoriates. This is the cultural problem behind the costly apparel that will become the hallmark of one of the themes of a competing religious idea throughout the rest of the Book of Mormon. In Mesoamerica, the time period of the early Nephites saw developing social stratification in the Maya cities and an increasing pressure towards kingship in those same cities. Interestingly enough, we've got two pressures that the Maya world is beginning to see at exactly the same time, that we have a king in the city of Nephi and we have costly apparel in the city of Nephi. And these pressures are happening all throughout the Maya lands, which just so happen to include highland Guatemala. This social differentiation was supported by the accumulation of esoteric goods, often displayed on the clothing of the elite. As Sheely and Matthews put it, people throughout Mesoamerica wore these currencies as jewelry and clothing to display the wealth and the enterprise of their families. Bringing in clothing and adornment from other locations is a way to create a differentiation in dress. When the clothing itself becomes the display mode for elite consumption of goods, then the costly apparel in and of itself becomes the marker of increasing economic and social distances between developing classes. It's important to remember that Jacob's issue is never wealth, but rather the social stratification that was based on wealth. The costly apparel was a unique Mesoamerican mode of creating and displaying that social separation. The pressures for creating social stratification that we see beginning in the city of Nephi mirror the greater trend in the entire Mesoamerican culture area at exactly this point in time. The presence of trade relations with other Mesoamerican communities therefore provides a context in which we may understand Jacob's sermon denouncing social stratification through wealth, particularly wealth manifest through costly apparel. It's that very same context that can explain why he preaches against polygyny and some of the anomalies of that discourse. By looking at the cultural background, we have to again note that Jacob's denunciation of polygyny is problematic for multiple reasons, none of which have anything to do with the obvious difference between Jacob's denunciation and historical LDS polygamy. First, Jacob consistently equates having more than one wife with whoredoms and unchastity. This is as impossible as valuable gold that is easy to find. Note that Jacob clearly speaks of wives, not of harlots. All societies that accept multiple wives have legal regulations that legitimize the union. A plural wife is a wife, and relations with a wife do not fall under the rubric of whoredoms in any society. Jacob also describes the fate of the wives and the children in ways that don't make any sense. He speaks of the daughters of Jerusalem being led away captive and that their children were being brought into destruction. Now, it's hard to see how the very fact of multiple wives could cause those things. There's lots of things that can happen to wives and children in marriage, but the very fact that you get married really doesn't create captivity, as much as we make jokes that says that it does. Once again, the cultural context of Mesoamerica gives us a way of seeing this text and removing those difficulties. The same context of trade provides the answer. The development of social segregation in Mesoamerica has been the subject of multiple theories and studies. One study used archaeological information to support the hypothesis that the development of institutionalized social inequality and political privilege was due to the internal social pressures of personal advancement. In terms of this theory, there were individuals who would seek improvement in their position, and they call them aggrandizers. These are people who say, gee, I want to feel like I'm better than I am. And so they go about finding ways to improve their relative position in the community. Aggrandizers, and this is a citation here, aggrandizers simply strive to become more influential. It is the successful deployment of resources and labor that ultimately ensure the social and political longevity of an aggrandizer. Building renown commences in the nuclear unit of production. An aggrandizer first accumulates deployable resources by the sweat of his brow and through the effort of his wife or wives and children. The more wives, the better. Mesoamerica had a long tradition of plural wives. And plural wives come into the picture precisely because they are in a position to assist in the development of excess economic goods. When we talk about the people who are going to be engaged in trade, and we talk about the people who are bringing back these costly apparel, we're talking about Nephites who are aggrandizers. They're trying to improve their position. That's exactly what Jacob is getting unhappy about, is that they're trying to improve their position above and beyond their neighbors. Where they get this good is by going to some other area and trading with someone. Who has the most available goods to trade? The man with multiple wives. The man who's going to get the goods sees the mechanism for providing excess labor and says, that's probably a pretty good idea. If I had an extra wife around, I could produce a little bit excess and I'd have more goods to trade. And that very context of trading with another society, another culture that has multiple wives, creates the condition where these men are going to want to have multiple wives. The last of these conditions that lets us know something about is when you trade wives with communities. We all know that people will swap wives and swap women as ways to cement relationships. Cementing economic relationships is probably a good idea to do. And what is probably happening with the women who are being led away captive is they're being sent to other communities of plural wives in the other communities. It's also easy to see a child whose world will be destroyed if they go live in a place that does not believe in God. Now, while the elements of the material from Enos to Omni are also elucidated by this interpretive framework of Mesoamerica, the next strong connection to Mesoamerican culture comes with the flight of the first Mosiah the First, and his followers to the land of Zarahemla. The history of Zarahemla involves another cultural area of Mesoamerica. In the ethno-history of Mesoamerica, the Olmec were the dominant political cultural influence prior to the rise of the Maya city-states. The transition from Olmec to Maya was not abrupt in either time or space. There was a continuation. Things kind of flowed. There was no time when they said, oops, I'm no longer Olmec, I'm now Maya. It just didn't work that way. There was a buffer zone between the two of them, and that buffer zone lies exactly where the limited Tehuantepec theory places Zarahemla and the land of, all of the land of Zarahemla. In the Book of Mormon, the land of Zarahemla is a meeting place between two peoples. We have now the situation where if we look at the plausible location of the land of Zarahemla in Mesoamerica, we have a place that is no longer in Maya lands. When they were the city of Nephi, they would have been in the heart of some Maya country and would have been surrounded by Maya. They would have fled that, come up over the mountains and up into the headwaters of the Sidon. By doing that, they have moved out of the cultural realm of the Maya and they have moved into a liminal area that is in between the Olmec and the Maya areas. The Olmec by this time are fading out, but the traditions of the Olmec are moving up this valley, and what we have in this valley is an area that is not purely Olmec, but one which has heavy Olmec influences. However, in the city of Zarahemla, plausibly Santa Rosa, we also have connections back down into highland Guatemala and the city of Caminalpulyu, which is where Sorensen would have suggested that Mosiah and his people came from. Let's see, where's the best place to go? The new research on linguistics that has come out for the area where we are expecting Zarahemla to be has some information that it can teach us. The best candidate for the language of the Olmec is Mihesoke, which is a hyphenated comparison of two languages. They reconstructed it and decided to say, okay, well, it was the parent of those two daughter languages. That research was done in the 1970s and has been pretty widely accepted. Mihesoke is a language that occurs in the right cultural area to have been Olmec and occurs at the same glottochronological depth, which means probably about the right time period to have been the language of the Olmec. One of the things that has sort of skipped everyone's notice in the excitement of the translation of the Maya glyphs is the remembrance that there were a lot of other scripts. If you have seen any glyphs from Mesoamerica, you have seen Maya glyphs for the most part. That is by far the largest number of inscriptions that we have. However, recently there has been a large stela that has been uncovered with 540 glyphs of a different language. Interestingly enough, it is a language where the glyphs seem to indicate that there is a transference of information from this glyphic system into the Maya. There are some Maya glyphs that read phonetically incorrectly for Maya, but they read correctly on this stone for the language that it's in. They call this an Epi-Olmec language because it's in the general Olmec area, but Epi meaning it's after the Olmecs. It really isn't Olmec. In other words, we have a language and a writing system that is showing up in the time period for the Book of Mormon peoples to be in the land of Zarahemla. That can teach us a few things. One of the things that it teaches us is by looking at the language that it is written in. That language is Soke. We also have a shard from Chiapa de Corso, which is Sorensen's correlation with Sidon, which is in this Epi-Olmec language. So we have indication now of a language that's being spoken at approximately 160 AD in the middle of Book of Mormon times that is being spoken and written in lands of Zarahemla that, according to our plausible location, is placing it in Book of Mormon cities. And that tells us that it is highly probable that what happened is that when the Mulekites came into the Olmec area, they began absorbing Olmec culture. As they were moving up the valley, they retained that language. When they got to Zarahemla, they would have been Soke speakers. We cannot be certain what language the Nephites spoke. I'm sure that several people here would argue with me when I gave some of my theories of what they might have spoken. Whatever happened, if they came as a smaller population into the city of Zarahemla, it is highly likely that the larger population language won out, and that from the Book of Mormon, from the time of land of Zarahemla on, most of the people are actually speaking Soke. So we actually have a language for them. Doesn't help us much, but we have a language for them. All right. In addition to the language and the writing systems, the cultural heritage of Zarahemla would have included the religion of the Olmec region. And we can see some of the religious clash between the Nephite gospel and the Mesoamerican religion of the Zarahemlites in the contentions that Mormon refers to for the beginning of King Benjamin's reign, when he has lots of contentions and political struggles that he deals with. One of the passages that may receive a greater explication from the Mesoamerican context is found in the Words of Mormon 1:15. He indicates there that there had been false Christs among the people. Now, on the first surface of it, that's a little odd. First of all, we might expect a false Christ, but first of all, how are we going to get false Christs? Secondly, you really only get a false Christ in a Christian world if you have people who believe it. And if they're coming into a cultural area who had lost their God, according to the Book of Mormon, the idea of having a false Christ kind of doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. However, there is a situation in Mesoamerica that comes out of the Olmec and the rest of the Mesoamerican religions that gives us a context that can let us understand that. Those religions had people that were called God impersonators. They were people who would wear the clothing of the gods and would, for that time period, become a god. In the later Aztec time period, these people were called the Ixiptla. But these are people whose job it is to impersonate the god. And since Christ is the God of the Nephites and Antichrist, he is easily defined as one of these people who is an advocate of the old religion and is still there impersonating God by being one of the God impersonators and wearing that paraphernalia. It's part of that cultural conflict that we see happening. The same conceptual background of the attempt to establish a new Nephite religion in the people steeped in an ancient Mesoamerican tradition also provides a richer context for the preamble to Benjamin's famous speech. One of Benjamin's first attempts to his people, or one of his first statements to his people, is that I have not commanded you to come up hither that ye should fear me, or that you should think that I am of myself more than a mortal man, but I am like yourselves, subject to all manner of infirmities in body and mind. Why would he say that? Unless he is dealing with a competing religion that says kings are deified, and that the old ancient tradition would have said that the king and the god are the same one, and therefore should not have been subject to all of those. And his very first statement is, I'm not that kind of a king. Benjamin's next set of remarks also fit into the people with having conflict over the nature of religion and kings, when he emphasizes his catalog of the kind of king he has not been. Why does Benjamin emphasize the negative side of the positive things he's done? The common context for a listing of what one has not done implies the possibility that they could have been done. And the easiest suggestion is that Benjamin is continuing to differentiate himself from the other kings that they might have known either in their own past or in the cultures with which they had contact. Above and beyond these points, there are other cultural and archaeological confluences around Benjamin's speech that are impressive. I dealt with some of those last year, and I'm not going to repeat them because I'd run out of time. However, now we go on a couple of other things. Moving on in time. The end of the reign of Mosiah II, this is Mosiah, the son of Benjamin, the son of Mosiah. The end of the reign of Mosiah II is the conclusion of the reign of kings among the Nephites. The transition from kings to judges had several parallels in Mesoamerican political systems. It's important to understand that the roots of the shift from a monarchic to a more communal government structure were already in place in the Book of Mormon prior to Mosiah's abolition of the monarchy. The voice of the people was a communal mechanism that acted even to confirm kingship. Sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that this voice of the people was something they just started up and that democracy shows up full-blown right at this point in time. This is a mechanism that was already there. It's a really fascinating one because it does not work like democracy at all. I toyed with the idea of talking about that, and when I put it into the paper and read it, I was at about an hour and a half, and so I cut it out. The change from a king to a more communal system of judges was clearly seen in Chichen Itza near the end of the Classic. While not as conclusive as the Chichen Itza case, the argument for an oligarchic political structure at Teotihuacan is very strong. Just as with the Book of Mormon case, the structures that allowed this power shift away from single kings to a more communal rule were already in place and functioning in those Mesoamerican monarchies. Ethno-historical sources tell us that the Maya community had a popolna, or a mat house. The mat house was a community location where the lords convened and where all important community matters were discussed and where disputes were adjudicated. This is a Mesoamerican system of judges by the nobles of the land that was already in place under the kings. It is very easy to see how someone who has already in place a system of adjudicating through these local leaders, how it's very easy to move to that as soon as you decide to remove the king. And in fact, in Mesoamerica, that happened in a couple of communities, and there are glyphic texts that appear to indicate that even in some cases where the king maintained his monarchy, he had to begin to share the limelight with these people who were ruling in the Popolna, or the judges who were also participating in the government of the society. So one of the things that we see in the Book of Mormon, this shift in politics away from a monarchy and towards a system of judges, has direct parallels in Mesoamerican political systems. The unique Mesoamerican political systems provide further definitions that inform our understanding of the events of the Book of Mormon. One place where there's a clear consonance with Mesoamerican politics and an equally clear dissonance with Joseph Smith's worldview is found in the account of Ammon's missionary efforts among the Lamanites. In Alma chapter 20, we have the converted king Lamoni accompanying Ammon on a visit to the king of the land of Middoni. On the way, they meet Lamoni's father, who is king over all the Lamanite lands. And here's the trick. We have the king being met by another king. The concept, this situation is clearly foreign to Western conception of kings. Kings might rule over lords, but we do not expect a king over kings. This concept is so ingrained in our Western thinking that the title King of Kings is immediately applied to Christ and to none other. Nevertheless, we have precisely the situation in Mesoamerica, most powerfully attested with the translation of the glyphs that outline the political overlordship of such places as Tikal and Kalakmul, among others. On top of the dead-on accuracy of the king over kings in the Lamanite territory, we have another somewhat unusual set of circumstances for which there's a clear Mesoamerican precedent. Lamoni and Ammon are traveling together so that Lamoni could persuade a king with whom he is friendly to release Ammon's brethren. It's very important to understand that we're not likely to be speaking here of friends in the modern sense of the word. They may certainly be friendly, but these are two kings, and they rule over different cities. In a Mesoamerican context, where we're placing events of the Book of Mormon, such a friend is an ally. City-states in Mesoamerica were frequently at war with other cities. Alliances were forged and broken. Among the allied kings, however, there were frequently formal visits to allied cities that had strong political overtones. These are listed in the glyphs. There's text that in stone make sure they mention when these people are going back and forth and making these site visits. Thus, when Lamoni declares Antiomno as a friend, he is more probably indicating that this is an ally with whom there are some mutual expectations. The arrival of a king from one city to another was an occasion that later years would be sufficiently significant to commission a record in stone. This is no casual meeting of friends who went bowling together every Tuesday. This is a formal exchange of state, and it's in this very formal setting that we must understand the nature of the flattery that Lamoni suggested that he was going to have to use to free Ammon's brethren. Remember that this is a king who was trying to persuade a king to reverse a king's decision. You know how difficult that is in history when you have a king who has to say, oops, sorry, I was wrong, I'll do it some other way. Kings don't like to do that. So we have a formal arrangement. The nature of Mesoamerican intersite visits also explains Lamoni's father's visit to Lamoni. We are told that he comes because Lamoni did not attend a designated feast in the over-king's city. Without a cultural context in which to see this event, we simply have an irritated father coming to chastise a son. In the context of the important political balance associated with Mesoamerican intersite visits, we have the Overking investigating a possible defection from his coalition. And it makes a lot more sense that he'd come to check that out. The last odd circumstance of this occasion is the one-to-one battle of the Overking and Ammon. This event should not happen in the canons of Western thought. It is unthinkable for a king to travel without an army to do his fighting for him. We do not know whether or not such an army was with Lamoni's father, but we do know that they didn't enter into that conflict. They could have been there. We don't know. All we know is that this Overking, who had a seated son, this is a man who was old enough to have a son who was old enough to be a king. Think about that one. And he is giving hand-to-hand battle to Ammon. And he probably doesn't know it, but this is the guy that's been slicing off people's arms in recent history. This is not a fair fight. Why does the father of Lamoni pick it? Why does this older man, who probably can see that he doesn't have all that much of a chance against a younger and stronger man, what in the world is he doing in one-to-one combat? The answer to that is, again, Mesoamerican. The glory of Mesoamerica is in hand-to-hand combat. And all of the stone records exalt the captives that the king takes himself. And there's one particular record of a king at age 80 who is taking captives. The people who translated that particular text said, well, he must have had somebody else fighting for him. But there are enough of these reasonably aged men fighting that it's entirely possible they really do have an 80-year-old man out there who may have been set up to take the captives. But we have an 80-year-old king out there taking captives. That's what he's doing here. He is a king and he must participate in hand-to-hand battle. Went one page too far. Mesoamerican politics and religion conjoined to provide a new backdrop for yet another story from the Book of Mormon that's problematic without such a context. I'll tell this one, then I can get through with Pastor. Story of the anti-Nephi Lehies. Really a cool story because we have the story of these people who decided that they're Lamanites, they've joined the church, they decided that now that they're members of the church, they're going to lay down their arms. And so they do. Lamanites come up to them and they just sit there, passive resistance, no arms at all, and they get whacked to death. And pretty soon it says in the text that the Lamanites even got tired of this kind of slaughter. But what's really fascinating is right after the story, it says, but they were still bloodthirsty. They didn't have enough of killing people who weren't fighting back. And so they said, you know, what we really got to do is go wipe out Ammonihah. And so right after this, they head off to a city that's a long distance away, kill a bunch of people, take a few captives, and come back. That is a long way to go for a drink, even if it is bloodthirst. So we have this really strange thing. The next thing that's strange is we have apparent exaltation of the concept of pacifism in the Book of Mormon. We think this is really cool because they laid down their arms. Nobody else does. Nowhere else in the Book of Mormon does anybody lay down their arms and die. They all pick up their arms and go fight. What do you think? I mean, we exalt Captain Moroni because he put this title of liberty together and said, let's go fight, boys. You know, how come we're not exalting them like the anti-Nephi Lehies? The next thing that's really curious about this one is that it only applies to a certain generation. Their sons weren't under the same obligation. Well, why is it okay for their sons, but it's not okay for them? Next thing is they keep talking about why they had to lay down their arms, and it says it's because of our murders. Well, okay, maybe the people who were fighting in war would define what they did as a murder, but that's pretty unusual. Military never defines it as murder. We have casualties, we have a number of euphemisms, but we never murder anybody when we go to war. So it's really strange that they are going to call it murders. And the second thing is, it's all the women and the older children who also are saying, hey, we have this problem with our murders. And when did the women and children, over a certain age, ever murder anybody? The Mesoamerican context that answers all of those interesting little sets of problems is the cult of war. The Maya were obsessed with the cult of war. It is written in their stones. It is exalted in everything that we have found out about them. For a number of years, there was the idea that the Maya were these peaceful, stargazing priests. We've now learned that these are the most bloodthirsty people that have ever lived on the planet. The Aztec get the bad rap for putting people on stones and ripping their hearts out. At least that was quick. The Maya were very frequently very slow about it and tortured their victims. It really wasn't very nice of them at all. There are parts of the cult of war that are very important for us to understand, and one of the major ones is that the cult of war had multiple purposes, some of which was to secure territory, but what they would do isn't move anybody in, they would set up a tribute system. You see that happening throughout the Book of Mormon, where rather than a place be conquered, they said, yeah, why don't you just give us some stuff? The other thing that happens in the cult of war is that it is involved with captives. You are to take captives in battle and you bring them back, and what you do with the captives after you bring them back is you sacrifice them to gods. And this is, theologically for them, what makes the world go round. Now, we are in a Lamanite situation, and we have Lamanites who join the church. And you can imagine that if you had to join the church and all of a sudden completely change your worldview, what makes the world go around is not the blood of the sacrificed captives, but the blood of the Savior. It's not the continual sacrifice of humans, but the sacrifice of our hearts. That the science of the world is completely different, that we begin to understand why they said that it was something that was so hard for them to do. They not only had to give up a religion, they had to give up an entire cosmology, an entire way of seeing how the world worked. Now the next thing that we learn is that it's got to be generational, because it is a particular generation of people who believed in this. And just like a drunk does not want to, a reformed alcoholic doesn't want to return to alcohol, it's very understandable that these people who had left the cult of war would not want to return to anything that would have brought back those feelings that they were trying to get rid of. But because it's that one generation, their children, young children, who had not taken the covenant because they had not been part of that cult, had not been indoctrinated in it, would not have had any reason to believe that way and not have had the same danger. So we can find a generational reason. We also find a reason why the women would have been under the cloud of the murders, because they would have been willing participants in the society that sacrificed those men. On top of all of that, we have a few other things that are kind of interesting. One of them is that they buried their weapons. I've heard people talk about, well, maybe this is where you get the idea of burying the hatchet. No, that's probably not right. But there is a Mesoamerican reason behind what they did. When Mesoamericans had sets of goods that they wanted to dedicate to the gods, they would cache them. And the word cache means they buried them. And we dig up all the time caches of things that were offered to God. And if they are going to give up their arms and do it for a religious purpose, it certainly would make some sense that they're going to give it up for God, and that they would see as a logical way to do that is to cache them. And so they buried them. Now we're at the last interesting part, which is how in the world the destruction of the city of Ammonihah ties into all of this. We have the destruction of the innocent, and the Lamanites here in the position where they've just wiped out everybody, and they've killed as many people as they want to kill, and they said, oh darn, this is too easy, I'm going to go kill somebody harder. Why would they do that? In the text, Mormon tells us why they're coming up against the city of Nephi. They are rebelling against their king. And they said, we want to overthrow the king and put a new one in place. Now, Mormon isn't too interested in politics, and so he doesn't tell us much about that. But we can pretty much assume that it worked for two reasons. One, the next time we see the anti-Nephi guys, they're fleeing to Zarahemla. They're not Nephi anymore. They're probably being kicked out. The next thing is, there was no resistance. Of course they're going to be able to overthrow the king. Nobody prevented them from doing it. So they put a new king in. That makes all the difference in Mesoamerica, because one of the things that must happen, again, part of this religion of the cult of war, is that when you install a king, you must have captives in battle so that you can extol them in stone of the people that you captured. They didn't have any, because the people of anti-Nephi didn't fight back. Okay, now they've got a problem. What problem do we have? We've got a new king that we're trying to seat in the city of Nephi. We don't have any captives to sacrifice. Now what do we do? Okay, let's go make a lightning raid on the city of Ammonihah that isn't expecting us. We don't care whether or not we get any land out of them, because we don't want. The only thing we want to bring back are the captives. And the text of the Book of Mormon tells us that the only thing they took out of there, it doesn't mention anything about booty, about spoils of war. The only thing it says that they took from the city of Ammonihah was captives. And with seating a new king in the Maya world, they needed them. Time to wrap up. Okay. I knew I'd go over time. What we've been looking at has nothing to do with proof of the Book of Mormon, because none of those things are the kind of thing where you could say, oh yeah, okay, I see where that makes a proof. What they are, however, is a set of complex interrelated coincidences that are really hard to explain away. When you start talking about a Mesoamerican context that can tell us why certain discourses were being given, that can tell us why the city of Ammonihah was important to be taken at that particular point in time, when you can use an interpretive context to be productive and be able to give you more information than you had before, you begin to see times when there's a probability that you're looking at a context that has a chance of reflecting the actual situation of the Book of Mormon. When you compare that with some of the coincidences like tents, that are those single points of coincidence around which the entire world can spin, these are more complicated. These are more specific to a very close time and place. And for my money, it tells me a lot more that the Book of Mormon is exactly what it says it is, which is an ancient text that took place in a particular point in time. Thank you.
Questions? Any questions? Come up here.
I just have a couple things. First, I suppose this makes a little more sense of when Nephi in 2 Nephi says that already they've had wars over the rulership. It's hard to imagine 12 guys having had wars, you know. My question is this. Is it this the fact that the Nephites, or Nephi and his people, had risen to the top of their social structure because of their old world trade skills, we assume, which they brought with them? Would that account somewhat for a lot of the negative reaction they had from the surrounding communities over this economic thing? I mean, the Laman and Lemuel also seem to have at least risen to some position with the other group that was stayed behind, you know.
The whole idea that the Lamanites were always a lazy people is an interesting cultural conceit of the Nephites that is belied by the text of the Book of Mormon. They certainly brought something that somebody else wanted. And once you have something that somebody else wants, you will either get it through trade, or if for some reason the trade isn't favorable, you might try to go take it. It's also very interesting that early in the Book of Mormon you get descriptions of things which are much closer to skirmishes than they are wars. We get wars much later in the Book of Mormon, and one of the reasons for that is the politics change. Early in the Book of Mormon, skirmishes are more like what's going to be happening because you're probably getting some squabbles over economics. You get major wars because there's ideological or land problems coming later.
So, what you're saying then is that some of these squabbles are being caused by this change in economics and other stuff that the Nephites caused.
That's probable. It's knowing what we know about that area, they seem to have been pretty bellicose anyway. So they were pretty much in the mode of kind of fighting anybody no matter what. The evidence is this cult of war goes back pretty far in time. So some of the skirmishes may do nothing more than simply say, you know, I get to beat you over the head and take you back captive. Some of them may not have had any economic justification at all.
Thanks.
Anything else?
I was fascinated with your comments about the intermingling of the Mulekites with earlier peoples. I lived in Guatemala for a while and had a chance to visit the coast where the Book of Mormon scholars think the Mulekite country was. And I was intrigued with the notion of linguistic metathesis, that is the inversion of vowels and consonants. To me, it could be one of the strong elements in the Book of Mormon studies to think of the Olmecs being a metathesis for Olmecs, or Olmecs being a metathesis for Mulekites. What do you think of that?
Definitely not in that particular case. There are two Olmec cultures. There is what's called the historical Olmec and then the Olmec. The Olmec, we don't know what they called themselves. Olmec is a later title coming out of Aztec that was applied to these people erroneously. They took a name out of the Aztec texts and said, oh, these must be the Olmec. And then they found the historical Olmec, and so now we have two of them. But both the name Olmec, it comes from much later time, and it was only a modern misapplication of that name that got there. So that particular case wouldn't have happened.
Okay. Another comment on kings over kings. Certainly in Ireland, there were regional kings, dozens of them, with the High King. And in later European history, of course, there was the Holy Roman Emperor who ruled over the geographic.
Oh, yeah, you could, certainly the idea of an emperor ruling over kings, you would. Oh, yeah.
Well,
Yep.
okay.
Sorry, I just want to get actually two in real quick. One of them has to do with a lot of the earlier works that dealt with patterns like this. For example, Farnsworth's book, The Americas Before Columbus, things like that. How have those panned out? And then my second question, maybe you could expound on a little bit, is the difference between a written language and a spoken language, I guess, among the kind of culture that the Nephites had.
On the first one, I would say that anything that LDS scholars attempted prior to when Sorensen published, and actually David Palmer published some of Sorensen's stuff before Sorensen got a chance to do it, I would say anything prior to that time is highly suspect. A lot of what happened early on is that we would pull lots of things from lots of different places, and you'd pull, a baptismal font from South America and put it with a tower in Palenque. And what you end up with is not only continents apart, but thousands and thousands of years of time period. And so there wasn't any consistent effort to try to look at a real specific location and time. As far as the difference between written and oral languages, those are around all over. There were several scripts that there were in Mesoamerica. Oddly enough, they are only in certain languages that have certain consonant vowel constructions. The Mihe Soke and the Maya led themselves to a glyphic text because of the way the texts were put together. The Aztecs could never have done it because of the nature of their language. So the later populations never had them. That probably doesn't answer your question. Sorry. Yes?
I don't know if you're the right speaker to answer this question, but would you comment on the meaning of secret combinations in the context of your talk?
The best answer I can give to that one is I don't know yet. The way I'm finding out all of this stuff is I'm just sort of going through the Book of Mormon step by step, and one of the reasons that I stopped where I stopped in discussing cultural context is that's as far as I got. I'm really hesitant of saying too much more about something I haven't spent enough time studying on to know. Brother Peterson, I know, has got an article on that, and you might want to talk to him about his ideas.
Thank you very much.